Right, okay, well, we shall make a start as we have got two fascinating speakers with a great deal of experience and expertise to impart to us and give us the opportunity to quiz them on their experiences and perspectives. So before introducing the two speakers that we have, David Cooper and Vin Fleming, I'll just say a few words about CASCADE. So CASCADE, for those of you who are joining our webinar, this is the third webinar in our series, joining for the first time, our formal name, the Conservation and Sustainability Consortium of Academic Institutions, brings together higher education institutions, and there's about 35 of us at the moment from across the UK. And those have academics that are really passionate and concerted in finding those sustainable solutions, and really particularly working towards supporting the global biodiversity framework in its implementation. We are inevitably largely UK-based, but exclusively UK-based, with many partners around the world. And these are some of the founding members. So we can move on to that next slide. A lot of our rationale is really derived from a report that UNEP WCMC produced in the run-up to the adoption of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And three of their key findings that supported the finalisation of CBDs, the Convention's long-term strategic framework for capacity building, that are now in the Global Biodiversity Framework, is we really are not, as a community, as networked as well as we should be between biodiversity professionals, academia and governments. We need to be much better networked and share our knowledge. And part of the reason for that is that we're not really coordinated amongst those different actors. And all of this led to the conclusion that we really need to find ways of working that bridge much more effectively that science policy boundary. So we are promoting training and awareness to foster these interactions at all levels, particularly amongst academia, local governments and society. So we are funded in our first 2-year pilot by UK Research and Innovation. And really we've got three objectives to really try and get to grips with what we'll actually put into practice, that academic understanding of what it is we need to do. So the first objective is to understand how well we, thinking particularly of biodiversity, and at the moment as well, particularly perhaps international biodiversity, what is our capability in the UK across these higher education institutions? Where do we have professional services colleagues working as knowledge exchange, academics working in knowledge exchange within universities and between universities? So what is our capability, and where do we need to improve that? And then secondly, when we've got that knowledge, we really need to understand how we can, in some ways, move from being from 35 institutions. If you are working, for example, for the CBD Secretariat, and you might think there are particular knowledge needs, what's an efficient way of engaging with UK higher education? So we're really trying to see how we can move from 35 separate universities and higher education institutions to one entity, one place where those that would like access to academic information, to knowledge, can come and engage with us. So building our own consortium of cohesion and structures. And in order to guide us in that, we're working particularly with the CBD Secretariat at the global level. And initially it was JNCC, but that's expanded very quickly to include the international biodiversity colleagues at DEFRA as well, to represent the UK government, to really understand how we can take advantage of many opportunities. Which are the opportunities that are going to be most effective in helping us as academics contribute most effectively to the global biodiversity framework nationally and internationally. So moving on now to introduce our two speakers who are going to set the scene, roughly 10 minutes or so each. David Cooper. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce David, who has more than 30 years of experience in environmental and agricultural science and policy and international negotiations. And that includes more than 20 years at the Convention on Biological Diversity's Secretariat in Montreal in Canada. And particularly, David was the Deputy Executive Secretary at the Secretariat from 2015, before serving as Acting Executive Secretariat for a couple of years in 2023 and 2024. David was instrumental in facilitating the complex pathway that led to the successful finalisation and adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that was adopted at COP15 in December 2022, and many other key decisions taken at that same COP, including those on digital sequence information and genetic resources and on resource mobilisation. David retired from the CBD after COP16 and is now a visiting fellow at the Oxford Martin School and the Leverhulme Centre for Nature Recovery at the University of Oxford. And when David has given us his introduction, he'll be followed straight away by Vin Fleming. And Vin is the former leader of the International Advice Team at JNCC. And over his career, Vin has played a pivotal role in developing UK positions for successful negotiations at both the Convention on Biological Diversity and also Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES. Vin represented the European region in the Animals Committee of CITES for almost a decade, advocating strong support for evidence-informed approaches to measures intended to achieve sustainable trade across the full spectrum of CITES-listed animals. Vin was a core part of the UK's negotiating team at the CBD's COP15, where the Global Biodiversity Framework was adopted. Vin is now retired and working as an independent consultant and is serving, thankfully from our point of view, as chair of CASCADE's Advisory Group. So that's plenty of introduction, and I will now hand over to David to share his perspective, his global perspectives on international policy processes.
Thanks so much, Phil, and it's good to be here with you all in this CASCADE webinar. So I will focus on the CBD, but I think much of what I'll say will be relevant to other related biodiversity processes and other multilateral processes. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. And we often hear that these processes are bewildering to academics and to others who are trying to get evidence into policy making and then to support implementation. These are just a few shots from the last meeting at the COP16 in Cali, Colombia. And here I just wanted to mention that, of course, a meeting like this, many different things are happening simultaneously. There are negotiations going on, and often that's where people are trying to influence the outcomes, but there's also a lot else going on in the margins, side events and so on, which can have important inputs into the process over the longer time, can help to set the agenda going forward. And of course, these happen in many different forums. But if we go to the next slide, sort of focus a little bit on that formal process. And just to note that the COP meetings are, for this purpose, the end of a sequence of events. And if academics want to get information into that policy-making cycle, then that information, those inputs, whether they're through participating in expert groups that the CBD convenes, whether it's contributing to studies or whether it's commenting, peer reviewing on documents that are in draft form, those usually need to happen well upstream of when the final decision is going to be made at COP. So the CBD establishes a number of ad hoc technical expert groups. It undertakes a number of studies. These go to SubStat or to one of the other subsidiary bodies. There's now two others, the subsidiary body on implementation and the subsidiary body on issues related to traditional knowledge and Indigenous peoples and local communities. before then they go on to the COP itself for decision making. Also to note, of course, now that we have and have had for many years our very own scientific, sorry, back to the our very own scientific body, IPBES, the IPCC for biodiversity, if you like, and there's major opportunities for the academic community to contribute through the work of IPBES. On to the next, and I just want to illustrate actually how I think science and other forms of evidence have been very relevant in the development of the global biodiversity framework. I think you're all familiar with that, but next slide just gives an overview of the framework, its mission, its 4 goals, its 23 targets, and its mechanisms to support implementation. Next slide. It's acknowledged right at the beginning of the GBF that the framework seeks to respond to the global assessment on biodiversity and ecosystem services issued by IPBES. So I think it's clear that the scientific foundations for the GBF were set out essentially in the IPBES report and in some others. It was complemented by the Global Biodiversity Outlook, which it issued in 2020, that gave an update on the progress towards the implementation of the previous plan and the Aichi targets. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that this also, the GBF also benefited from a lot of other scientific work. The whole idea of halting and reversing the loss of biodiversity responded to not only, but responded to papers issued in the scientific community calling for this level of ambition and showing through models and scenarios how that could be done. And if we go to the next slide, we can see also that during the course of the negotiations, and in this case, I'm focusing on one specific target, target 7, there was quite a lot of almost real-time input from the scientific community, advising the working group that developed the Global Biodiversity Framework on the text of Target 7 on controlling pollution. So there we saw a very agile response. And if we look at the lessons in the next slide from the experience of working with the Global Biodiversity Framework, this is just one paper by Carol and others published in Conservation Biology, and their conclusion was that scientists can strengthen the effectiveness of global agreements and address challenges that are complex and so on, if they can do a few things. And they highlighted prioritizing communication, consensus building, and networking skills. And that is related to, I think, a number of things. One, making sure that messages coming from the scientific community resonate. They seem to be relevant. They resonate with the interests of developing countries as well as developed countries, and with the major groups in indigenous peoples, civil society, business communities that are also engaging in this process. Moving on to the next slide. So I've spoken much about how evidence will and can be brought into the development of policy. Once that has happened and COP has issued either a global strategy like the GBF or specific policy guidance that will have been informed by science, it's then up to countries for the implementation to happen. And we know that countries will develop their national biodiversity strategies and action plans and face the challenges of implementation. third dimension to this, and really important, is that this implementation is kept under review. The lessons of what works and what doesn't work is kept under review, and that this information is fed back in due course to the COP so that we can have, if you like, adaptive management, learning by doing on a global scale. So we need good evidence, not only to inform the development of global policy, but also to help countries and all the actors in countries, governments, local authorities, business, indigenous peoples, civil society, farmers, and so on, to implement what has been agreed. And so that's another area where evidence and scientific inputs are required. And then, of course, finally, we need to be able to monitor that progress. So we need indicators, we need scientific input to that level as well. Going on to the next slide. Just to see that actually most countries now, in the case of the Global Biodiversity Framework, are well, nearly all, yeah, a vast majority of countries have set national targets, which are more or less aligned with the aspirational global targets set in the GBF. And an increasing number of countries now have also updated their national biodiversity strategies and action plans aligned with the GBF. So this is where further support is needed. There are a number of mechanisms for that under the convention, some of which are highlighted in the next slide. If we have the next slide. And these are also potential avenues for inputs from the academic community. So that includes the new network of technical cooperation centers that was developed in response to the COP15 decision, this technical and scientific cooperation mechanism. Personally, I believe this is a really important area with a lot of potential to complement the top-down focus, if you like, in terms of policy development at the global level, and to have that policy development informed by what is happening at the national level. And also we need, of course, mechanisms for monitoring as well. The next slide. Note I'm running out of time, but we're almost there. And let's skip to the next one. So I just wanted to highlight, I think, 3 important points that are essential, really, if we want good evidence to support policy, good evidence to support implementation, and then monitoring of that implementation. Of course, one is that it's good evidence, it has credibility. Another that I've called here agility, but also perhaps saliency, that it's responsive to the needs at the time. And thirdly, legitimacy. And here I think we need to be aware of the global imbalances that we have, north, south, and so on. Also perhaps between the natural and social sciences so far in the CBD. The need to make sure we also take on board traditional knowledge for this evidence to be legitimate. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Phil, and I think over to Vin.
Right, thank you, David, and a fantastic introduction into the big overall global picture. I'm going to look at a bit more maybe ground level kind of approach. And just the opening picture here, just the UK delegation at COP15 in Montreal. In fact, not all the UK delegation is there, but if we can go to the next slide, please. So what am I planning to do in this presentation? I'm really going to try and advise or provide tips on how higher education institutes and others can best feed their knowledge and evidence into these international biodiversity policy processes. And the emphasis here will be predominantly on CBD, of course, because that's our focus here. But it's also relevant to some of the other biodiversity MEAs, the multilateral environmental agreements like CITES or the Convention on Migratory Species, recognizing also that they have their own different rules and procedures and so on. And I'm focusing this guidance or tips, if you like, in terms of those people who are outside the kind of policy making sphere, the kind of people who are not on government delegations, but are trying to feed into those. But in that respect, you know, I'm pleased to see that in some of the attendees, we've got my former friends and colleagues from JNCC and DEFRA, whose reflections might be very valuable later in the discussion, and they can also correct me where I've got things wrong. But the next slide, please. So what's the first tip, really? And I think David has alluded to this already, when he's kind of mentioned that very often to most people, their first encounter with CBD or other MEAs can be fairly bewildering. There's a whole series of different bodies. There's COPS, Subster, SBI, there's contact groups, Friends of the Chair, plenary sessions. There are rules of procedure to familiarize yourself with. So it can be a bit bewildering, but you know, it's a key thing if you're going to engage that you understand the system, really. And some of the best ways of doing that really are attending meetings face-to-face, follow them online if you can't, and of course, focus on the agenda items that are of interest to you. Get a feel for the issues being discussed, who is saying what, you know, what angle are different countries, parties coming from. But I think you do also have to be very clear about your objectives and what you want to achieve at an MEA, you know, why you actually going about engaging with it. And you also need a degree of realism too, which I'll come back to. But I think it's also a key point is, David had already mentioned, it's the parties that make final decisions. 196, if I've got the number correct, for CBD at the moment. And in CBD, they make those decisions by consensus. So it's the parties, if you want your evidence to feed into decisions, they're the ones who you need to inform and influence. Next slide. So what's your best way into contact with the various parties? And of course, personal contact with individuals in party delegations is, you know, really one of the best ways to get to know how best to feed your evidence into party positions. But of course, from the outside, it's very hard to know who to connect with. But if you're at meetings, you can see who is leading on your topic of interest. Usually it's the same person who's speaking on synthetic biology, or perhaps a different person who's speaking on biodiversity and health, but generally the same individuals stick with their same major kind of topics. And of course, there's participants list of national focal points that enable you to find out who best you might want to contact. And I think it's worth remembering here, you don't need to go in cold. You've got a Cascade team here, which already have good links with key individuals in the delegations. Phil McGowan, for example, has been to CITES and CBD meetings for many years. And of course, you also need to be aware of when there are formal calls for evidence or other input from parties and observers, such as academia. And I'll come back to the current notification on indicators later. Next slide. So, you know, if you have evidence that, and I'm using evidence here as a shorthand for any form of knowledge exchange, you know, who wants it, where and how will it make a difference? What are you looking to achieve? And, you know, if you have evidence, what format or product is best to communicate with? And, you know, you should remember that policymakers and governments are not living in an evidence void. They have access to their own scientific advisors, like JNCC in the UK. The departments have internal evidence teams. You know, they can access published literature, grey literature, and also, you know, the major reports by IPBES and others. But as David said, you know, science is critical to the working of all the biodiversity MEAs. And again, as David has mentioned, you know, science was critical in informing and influencing the targets and the global biodiversity framework and enabling positions progress against these to be measured, and informing, positions taken by parties in debates. So there is a very clear need and demand for evidence. Next slide. So, well, yeah, I've kind of covered this partly already. How do you provide that evidence? It needs, to be policy relevant and fit for purpose. And most policymakers are very time constrained, especially in the run up to meetings. And again, I'll come back to that in a short while. So making your information readily accessible means it's more likely to be assimilated and used and considered by parties when they are deciding on what positions they are going to take to meetings. And of course, options for presenting your evidence include evidence syntheses. Cascade has done some of those, information documents, if that is possible, preprints of papers or their final published versions, web pages, and side events. And I mentioned that policymakers are time constrained, and of course, so are people in academia or any other kind of sector as well. So there is, I'll mention this a little later, quite a time, another resource kind of burden, really, if you're going to look to engage. But I want to say a little bit more about side events. Next slide, please. Because, David showed that slide where there's lots of things happening at a conference of the parties. And side events are a very popular and very effective way of sharing research or building contacts, presenting evidence, and seeking to influence opinions. You have to be clear, who is the audience? Is it parties or is it other observers, people you want to network with? And David, as David said, at a COP, there's typically two, maybe more parallel words happening. There's those, especially in parties, who are directly involved in the negotiations. And then perhaps there's a separate constituency of observers, maybe attending side events and networking. And the two, of course, overlap. And, observers follow negotiations, and negotiators also attend side events and so on. But speaking personally, I've always found it quite difficult to attend, even a few side events at the COP, usually because other things intervene. And I think it's an important point to remember that, as David said, you need to get things in quite a bit upstream if they're going to influence the debate. And so having a side event at the meeting they're held is unlikely probably to influence negotiating positions, because, and if I can have the next slide, timing and timelines are critical. You need to introduce evidence into the process at the right time. Okay, but when is that? And you need to think also not only about the timelines that are happening within the convention, but internal processes happening within governments. And also you need to be able to respond quickly and to take opportunities when they arrive, the agility point made by David earlier. Next slide. Internal government processes. You should be aware of the pressures on government policymakers when they're preparing for a big MEA meeting. They're preparing their negotiation positions, their lines to take well in advance of meetings, because they need time for internal discussions. They may have to seek the views of other government departments, and ultimately, ministers will have the final say on negotiation positions. And of course, ministers are more interested in the high-profile issues or those with the greatest implications. And also, policy decisions are influenced by a range of factors, not only the scientific evidence, but by other socio or economic factors, perhaps. Having said that, I think there is, certainly within the UK, a strong desire, for evidence-based decision-making. So providing that evidence is going to help. But by the time you get to a COP or another subsidiary body meeting, there may be limited flexibility in government positions. So there may be a limited, by the time you get to a COP, for example, you may not have much chance to influence the line that a particular party is going to take. Next slide. And yeah, be realistic. Don't expect instant results. Okay, and I'm coming up to time, so I will move more quickly. You don't expect things to happen very quickly, and as I mentioned already, there may be significant costs involved in engagement, time, resources, travel, but there's a big win there. Next slide. And target 5, this was just one example of a process. So target 5, the target on sustainable use, Cascade and others have been working on a binary indicator. There's been lots of work over past decades on this, but there was a workshop in August last year which came up with a draft binary indicator. And that was taken to COP16 and shared and socialized as a document at 2 side events. It was on the virtual display table, which I find impossible to find things on when you go back to it. You know, and those discussions enabled Cascade and others to get feedback from parties and enable that indicator to be revised and improved. But there was no enthusiasm at the time to add it to the list of indicators in the monitoring framework. You know, decision 1631 at COP16 left the door open for future indicators to be considered. A recent notification issued a short while ago invited submissions by the end of May. And so this revised draft indicator is currently being peer reviewed and will, I'm sure, be submitted by the deadline. And then the process continues. So all these submissions will be reviewed by a subster before COP17. So just submitting your evidence, you haven't finished because you will probably then need to follow that up at the next subster and the COP, you know, to answer questions by parties and so on. And I did have one more slide, but I think I've probably said enough. So yeah, I will say thank you. And that's it from me. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much indeed, David and Vin, for setting the scene globally and then having a real deep dive on how things may work in the UK. So we've got one question already submitted, and whilst hopefully people in the audience are thinking of a few other comments or maybe taking up Vin's invitation from to his DEFRA and JNCC colleagues to make any other observations. If you do have any questions or other observations, if you can pop those in the chat, and then we'll come back to pick those up. What I will do, and to give Dan Challenger a bit of advance notice, I'll ask you, if you don't mind, Dan, if you could unmute and put your camera on and then just read out your question rather than me read that out. So just before we get started with that, I've just got a couple of quick questions. So we've heard an awful lot. David's painted a very complex picture, if it could be perceived as, to the outsider, of this global biodiversity policy landscape. Lots of different ways of its science or knowledge is sought. And you, Vin, have talked about the policy cycle, specifically here in the UK. So given the complexity of biodiversity policy cycles nationally and globally, and the places in those cycles where science may be helpful, are there just one or two things that you think academics should pay particular attention to when planning engagement? David, if you could maybe give a couple of thoughts first.
Thanks. Well, yeah, I think a few things we mentioned about timing, but then also, I mean, trying to, well, there's a balance between, you know, informing policymakers of what they need to know with responding to questions from policymakers of what they say they want, and there is obviously room for the former, but I think it's really important that academics are trying to answer what policymakers are asking for and are trying to frame the information provided in a way that it can be usable, because a lot of these things are great in theory, but challenging in practice. And I think a related issue there also is how to deal with this issue of uncertainty. We know that is really important. So sometimes I suppose there's a risk that we certainly need to have clear and, if as far as possible, simple messages, but not to lose some of the caveats and the uncertainty that's around that. So getting that balance is also, I think, a challenge.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, David. Is there anything that you would like to add to that, Vin, in terms of David's response or some of the points you've made?
No, I think David's made, covered a lot of the points, especially the point I was going to make too about maybe, this policy, feeding evidence into policy isn't just a one-way process. It needs to be a two-way process so that policymakers are indicating the kinds of things that they want to know from academia, but also from the academic side, you're also feeding into policymakers the things you think they need to know. I think, timing issue, I think, come back to that quite often. I think there's an issue for academia maybe to look at what's likely to be on the horizon in CBD or CITES or whatever. And you can get a good feel from that just by reading the decisions from the previous COP, because that's setting out a whole series of processes that are going to happen. And you can look at those and see, where science may have, where there may be a scope for using evidence and so on. And I don't think, that necessarily is just a role for academics. They should, maybe look at what's happening, but I think it's a chance for policymakers to feed things back to the other way. You might be interested in this is coming up. Is there anything relevant you might have? But I think it's also a good role for CASCADE, as acting as a conduit or a kind of hub at the center where you could be. CASCADE core team might be looking at what's coming up, and they can then feed it out to your network, maybe. So, yeah.
Thanks very much, Vin. I do have a couple more questions, but I'm keen that we do hear Dan's question, as ever, very provocative or asking an interesting question, Dan.
Yeah, thanks, Phil, and thanks to David and Vin for their presentations. Very interesting indeed. My question is more on implementation. Let's imagine that the academic community, CASCADE, and others have fed scientific research into the CBD and into CITES. It's going to be increasingly difficult, I think, for countries, especially in the global south, to implement some of the provisions that they've signed up to, because it's a really tough world out there, right now, recognizing things like funding cuts from the US, potentially from the UK as well. So my question to David and Vin is really, how can we best support implementation of MEAs like the CBD and CITES, recognizing such funding cuts?
Would you like to jump in first, David?
So, that is a challenging one, and obviously implementation does require finance. So I think, the first is to continue to make that point. But I do think a lot. I think there's a big potential for learning from among parties and also among different actors within different countries, of what can work and what is more challenging. Obviously, circumstances differ from country to country, and I think there, we have the global south has just as much as the global north to contribute. So how can we facilitate this technical and scientific cooperation among parties? This is actually embedded as one of the articles of the text of the CBD, but there's only recently have we begun to really focus on that, and for then the COP as well to take into account the reality of what's happening on the ground and what's not, and take that into account in the next cycle.
Right, thank you, David. Do you have any reflections on that, Vin?
Not really. I think, there are big issues about resource mobilization and how resources are found to enable all parties, and especially the Global South, as Dan has indicated, to be able to implement all the targets that are, you know, very ambitious, you know, and challenging targets. I think there are issues too that, you know, I'm sure not really within my my sort of area of expertise, but, you know, there are issues about subsidies and how those might be realigned and how resources might be liberated that way. But it's perhaps not maybe the discussion for now. Certainly not by me anyway. But I think it is challenging, especially with the US, and it's likely a course of direction over the next 4 years.
Right. Thank you very much, David and Vin. Thank you very much for the question, Dan, as well. Clearly a conversation that will run for some time. In response to my first question, David, you mentioned that academics might want to think about responding to immediate kind of questions and things from policy that come from a policy direction, but also telling policymakers perhaps what, I think your words were something like the things that they should know or need to know. And Phil Stevens has got a very interesting question, which perhaps does give some insights into how the latter, that the more visionary information, might find its way into policy. So would you like to unmute and read that out, please, Phil?
Sure. Yeah, thank you both very much. Really interesting presentations there. But yeah, it was actually something you showed, David. You drew attention to the example of the paper by Georgina Mace, which you know proposed the whole idea, I suppose, of bending the curve, and it struck me that you know that there's a whole spectrum of academic ideas, from the kind of visionary through to the almost micro-technical, all of which might have a role in formulating international policy, but might need different types or levels of engagement to get them on that policy agenda, in that the sort of visionary ideas maybe don't need that much assistance because they make sufficient waves, you know, when they come out, that they would be picked up anyway and people would start to talk about them. Whereas the kind of micro-technical stuff that might make a difference in, you know, in how things are computed or analyzed or reported, might need much more effort, because actually it would come out with much less fanfare and be much harder to get that onto or in front of, I suppose, the people who are making policies. And I wonder if you recognize any kind of spectrum of effort or process that's required to get those different levels of output into the policy space. I hope that makes a very long-winded question, but yeah, interested in your thoughts.
Shall I start?
Yes.
Phil? So I think, yeah, certainly there's different types of evidence and different types of message, I guess. But I think the science or the evidence is important for the visionary work as well. So in two aspects. One is demonstrating also the need, right? The imperative. What happens if we do not repair the planet? What happens if we don't control climate change? So you know, that can help to make a vision something that people realize is needed. It's not just what, you know, one environmental constituency wants. It's something that's needed. And then secondly, to see how feasible that is. Of course, we know that these things are very challenging, but you know, some of the modeling work that was done ahead of COP15 did show that yeah, it is at least feasible to bend the curve, even if extremely challenging. Then I think also then, of course, you know, it's these high level things that I believe ought to be taking a lot of the negotiation time, because you know these have big implications and you want full buy-in from all the parties, and and across government and across society within them. So they're very important. The micro-technical are also incredibly important to support implementation. But there maybe the focus is more, should be more on capacity building and on adaptive management, on learning by doing and so on, rather than just the negotiations.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, David. Anything to add there, Vin?
Not an awful lot, really. I think it's sort of horses for courses, isn't it, really? Clearly, the big visionary papers like Georgina May's is and so on, are important at setting the big picture and helping to guide and direct, the content of the global biodiversity framework, for example. But as David also said, you also need some of the more detailed stuff to help implement a lot of the decisions or achieve the targets, know how to measure progress and so on. So I think it's all important. It's just coming in at different levels. And in that case, I think it's just taking the route in, which is most appropriate for what you're trying to achieve.
So I guess it comes back to that point, doesn't it, that you made during your presentation, that it's what is your objective, and then figuring out the best tactics to get there, I guess. I see your hand is up, James. I'm very conscious that we've got 10 minutes to go. We'd like to have a quick touch on a few final reflections and then our upcoming webinar. So great to hear from you, James. Maybe make it succinct if you can, please.
I can certainly try, Phil, and thank you very much. Thank you, Vin, and thank you, David, for comments and relation. I think there's a couple of comments I'd make, and then as a sort of, I'd like to get a reflection from particularly David, perhaps on something looking forwards. I think I want to re-emphasize something that Vin was saying about relationships, because they're very long-term in some of these engagements. I don't know how many conferences of the parties Vin's been to. I've been to 6 CMS conferences of the parties, and that's really important in terms of thinking about processes over those long-term periods, and the issue there about how that fits into the timescale for papers and so on. So thinking about, I mean, I'm already working towards the CMS Conference of the Parties in March 2026, because that's the sort of lead-in time that you need to be thinking about. And each of those meetings will have their own paper deadline, which you've got to hit, or the subject won't be being considered. So the other point I wanted to just make around that was, it's not just one convention. Think about it as it's the same countries and it's the same biodiversity. So we often get linkages between the conventions in terms of something that's discussed in one and then comes up in another, or gets a slightly different viewpoint from another. So, for example, conversations at CITES and CMS often interact with respect to the species conservation, because it's the same species, it's the same parties. So think about how to join the dots between conventions rather than just looking at one. And the question that sort of comes out about that is partly about evidence versus opinion. And it sort of comes back to some degree on the comment that David was just making about uncertainty. And I think in terms of where we are with some of the global discourse, I'd be interested to know the extent to which it's evidence that drives the change, or it's opinion that drives the change. And that may also relate perhaps to the changes that we've seen under CBD just recently in terms of a new governance mechanism with a new subsidiary body for Indigenous peoples and local communities. In some ways, is that the same thing as we had before, just formalized, or is it actually a step change in how that may change the governance of CBD, particularly in terms of how you may look at traditional knowledge versus scientific evidence? So I hope that helps and is sufficiently succinct.
Thank you, James. And do you have a reflection, David?
So quite a few sort of questions within that question, I think. I mean, firstly, definitely, yeah, the conventions, the multiple biodiversity conventions, and then others like climate change and so on need to be implemented together. as you know, the Global Biodiversity Framework is an attempt actually to be a bit of an umbrella for all, and CMS in particular was extremely active in the negotiations of the GBF, and so I think it is a unifying framework. I think the upgrading, if you like, of the working group on Article 8J and related provisions, so it deals with traditional knowledge, deals with Indigenous peoples and local communities, is important. I think it reflects the growing acceptance pretty much by everyone, and this was, I think, really just apparent in the room in Montreal at COP15. I could see, you know, that essentially, and I think everyone was recognizing that where biodiversity is being managed by Indigenous peoples and local communities, it tended to be in better shape than others. There's a very clear evidence for that, and it was an important conclusion of the IPBES global assessment. And so one could argue that should perhaps be integrated in the same body as Substa. It's dealing with, you know, another aspect of knowledge. But I think, yeah, I wouldn't say it's opinion, but it is the politics, the broader politics, which means it's, I think, perhaps more powerful for that to be its own body. And of course, it also reflects the greater focus we have in the Global Biodiversity Framework on rights-based approaches and the importance of rights-based approaches for implementation. Perhaps I'll leave it there just because I know we're running out of time.
Thank you very much, David. Yeah, we are getting very close to time, but I'm very keen that you have, both of you, maybe we'll let Vin go first. Just any final reflections, maybe just one sentence, one thought each, before then hand over to EJ to talk about the forthcoming seminars. And one thing that I think as some of this conversation's unfolded is, do you have any thought on how policy officials might actually make it easier to engage with academics, or for academics to engage with them? So whether you address that or not, I'm thinking of your final comments, with just one or two sentences each would be fantastic to wrap up. Your final thoughts, please. Vin, if you could go first.
After you, Vin.
Final thoughts, really, or take-home messages. I think it's a lot about kind of understanding the beast, really. Understand the process, CBD, CITES, or whatever that you are planning or hoping to engage with, really. Be aware of timelines and having to get evidence or knowledge into the process well upstream, as David mentioned. And to me, it's a lot about thinking about what are you trying to achieve and being realistic about the influence you can have, and, you know, maybe over what time period. So yeah, understanding the process, timelines, objectives, and realism, I think, are probably my take-home messages to think about. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben. David.
So I think in terms of what policymakers can do, it's really the other side of what I was saying earlier about uncertainty. I think policymakers need to be better at being able to accept some evidence, including the uncertainty around it. And then otherwise, I think challenges for the research community and perhaps for this network, Cascade and others, is to we're talking about biodiversity, and I think we talk about why diversity is important in ecological systems. So knowledge diversity is also important, and we need to strengthen I think the role of the social sciences in the process. That has begun to happen, but it needs to go further. And above all, the academic community needs to, I think, confront what is an ongoing challenge, and that is the barriers to interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity. including saying the word. You know, we all now talk about that. The last two IPBES assessments highlighted in terms of the nexus approach that we need to be looking at all things at once, in terms of the transformative change assessment, that we need to look very much at these this broader range of knowledge. And I think we really need to invest in that if we're going to make the next level of progress forward. And maybe I'll just end. I just want to highlight one piece of evidence or knowledge that, you know, The Guardian and other newspapers have been promoting in the last few days or weeks, but actually a year after the paper was published in Nature Climate Change, about that, you know, something like 89% of people globally want stronger action on climate change. I think probably we would see something similar on nature. That may not be surprising to us, but it is apparently, from that same research, surprising to the majority, to those same people. So a vast majority want stronger action. They believe they're in a minority. And that means, I think, that, you know, politicians act on the basis that it's in the minority, and the people themselves act on that basis. So this type of evidence, looking at what is important to people and how that can help us drive implementation, is also really important.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, David. And I'll just hand over now to EJ just to talk about our upcoming seminars. Thank you all very, very much indeed, David and Vin, for some fantastic insights. EJ.
Thank you. And just to say, this has been brilliant, and we've got 3 more brilliant seminars to go in our series. The next one is going to be Catherine Oliver and Laura Miga, who will do a really excellent talk, I know, on how do you actually evaluate whether you're doing well or not in knowledge exchange, which is an extremely difficult thing to do. So do sign up to come along to that webinar or to any of the future ones. The QR code is there, or you can just look on our website. And finally, we're really keen, in the spirit of knowledge exchange evaluation, to get your feedback. So if anyone has an opportunity, then please could you just get that QR code and send us a few bits of feedback. And I'll leave that up while Phil, just if you want to finish off at all. Yeah. So finally, thank you very much indeed to David and Vin. There's a huge amount of information you've presented, and finished with some really pointed calls on the way that we could, as academics, should be thinking about the way that we're engaging. And importantly, we don't have to start from scratch. We do have things and colleagues that we can turn to. So I have put a note in the chat that if there are those, I'm very aware of the nature of the question or the questioners. So if there are people who felt a little bit intimidated in asking questions, please do drop us a line. I've put my name there. Hannah's email address is also on that slide there. And we will do our very best to talk to David and Vin and to get answers to your questions, because we really do want to encourage this knowledge exchange to improve. Because as David finished off saying, really, globally, there's a huge concern about the state of the planet, and we all want to play our role in trying to bend that curve of biodiversity loss. So thank you very much indeed, David and Vin, and thank you all very much indeed for coming along and joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you.